think we are recording. Yeah, looks good. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Fear and Loving with Ranch. That is me, Richard William Guerra, as some of you know me. And really excited to have this dialogue today and do my first roundtable discussion with a lot of my friends and colleagues here to discuss the protest movement today that we are all feeling and being affected by. I'm going to kind of go around in a circle here, starting with Nika, and have everyone introduce themselves, and then we will get the conversation going. So, Nika, you can start.
Hi, I'm a state representative from Boston, Massachusetts. And for those who are local, I'll say that I have the neighborhoods of Jamaica Plain, Rossendale, Mission Hill, and a little bit of Brookline. Really happy to be here with you guys today. This is my first term, so there's a lot that's happened in the year and a half that I've been in office.
All right, Joseph, take it away.
Hi, my name is Joseph Akintolayo. I live in Dallas, Texas. I focus on the intersection of impact and technology and philanthropy. I'm really passionate about just moving the needle on human dignity and making sure that everyone deserves, their birthright, their birthright of dignity. Happy to be here today and to kind of discuss the topics that are really on all of our minds and our hearts.
Right. Ryan?
Hey, my name is Ryan Rising. I'm from Oakland, California. I work primarily with an organization called the Permaculture Action Network, and we mobilize people from concerts and cultural events to direct actions where people are building regenerative community spaces. So things like urban farms, community gardens, and other land-based projects that are providing for people's material needs while regenerating ecosystem health. But I've also been a direct action social movement organizer for the last 20 years, starting with the Iraq War and the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund kind of stuff, and then moving through Occupy and then Standing Rock, some of the solidarity work with Black Lives Matter around 2015, 2016, and then up until the last week where, I've been in the streets and doing a lot of organizing over the last 5-7 days.
Thank you. And Mitchell, round us out.
Hey, I'm Mitchell Gomez. I'm the executive director of Dancesafe. Dancesafe's a harm reduction and health education nonprofit, mostly working within music spaces, but also sort of trying to expose the racist origins of the drug war and the need to end the drug war in general. I really consider myself a cognitive liberty activist and an anti-drug war activist more than just like direct harm reduction services. But that's sort of how we move the conversation, is through building new models for dealing with substance use through harm reduction, so that we can show that there is no need for drug prohibition as a system, since that system is both inherently racist and also exploited by other racist actors within governmental spaces as a way of targeting communities of color.
Awesome, great. Well, I guess I'll give a little more of an introduction on myself after that. I live in the Cambridge, Boston area, originally from Texas, and I work with Decriminalized Nature here in Boston or in Massachusetts. And I'm a part of Cincy Media, Cincy Magazine. I've been working in the cannabis space more or less, and as an advocate in my own way, and also anti-drug war policies, and just feeling pretty passionate about doing things about this criminal justice system, specifically in terms of the substances, but also racism and people of color and how we are treated. I just a little more background. I was myself incarcerated. I've spoke on my program about it before when I was much younger here in Boston for a nonviolent first offense drug crime that I got hit pretty hard with. But if you have seen the Netflix documentary show How to Fix a Drug Scandal, I was also one of those individuals that was absolved from my record a few years back, hence really pushing me forward and seeing that this is part of my life's mission to see these laws change. So yes, just hearing everybody speak, it's an amazing group, and I appreciate everyone being here, and hopefully we can get some good dialogue going, and we'll be able to share this with a lot of people. So I think it feels really awesome to have someone who is a part of government in their own way with us, Nika. And you know, I actually went down to the Black Lives Matter protest a couple days ago, and was down there doing some Gonzo reporting rather, and you know, and I haven't been back, and I'm wondering, you know, it's just, I think there's so many of us out there that feel drawn to this movement and drawn to these protests, but maybe we can't go, or we're busy, or we can't make it something that we do. We're doing every day, and being in your home, like being here and knowing what's going on there, it's like I do have questions, and I am wondering what the government is doing and what the state is doing, and are they listening, and are there changes that we can expect, and maybe you can give us some insight on that.
Yeah, I've been wrestling in my mind since the few minutes ago that we started with which lens do I want to use to answer the question. Because, you know, as people of color, as a lifelong community activist and development person, before I ran for office only a few years ago, you know, 2018, I got elected. I started last year. I'm going to be 47 next month. So most of my life wasn't doing this. So I have that whole perspective on everything you just said. And then I have my perspective as an elected official, which is a different lens. And then I have my perspective as someone who grew up in poverty and communities of color, moved a lot, had violence and stuff, a number of related indicators of poverty in my home, in my neighborhoods. A lot of love too and support, but you know, a lot of the things that we, my husband and I as parents, don't want for our kid who's now married and didn't have to deal with any of that. And so even though the communities I grew up in were beautiful and made me who I am today, that crushing impact of oppression and structural racism and poverty all bundled up. But like that's exactly what you're trying to not have happen to people and not have happen to your kids. And so I have a different view than I feel like some of my co-activists. I just have a different lens that inside of me, and I think I'm going to land there for now, which is not the lens I usually use, because it sounds like the 15-year-old kids picking up guns in my neighborhood. Like that's what that lens sounds like. Because that was me. I mean, I refused the gun when it was foisted upon me by my father for a variety of reasons. But you know, if I had been a boy or other circumstances or more scared in that moment, I probably would have taken it and gone down a different path. So I have overcome everything I'm about to say, but I just want to be real with this group, just in honor of the words that you have all shared and what it means, fear and loving, like what that means. So I'm going to start with fear. And you guys can trust that the loving is in there, in me. You know, voting, protests, politicians, business people, lawyers, these are all things that I'm part of now that not too long ago I thought were a massive waste of time because they were just all so corrupt and disconnected from my life growing up and the lives of kids still growing up like I grew up. And I just felt like socialist movement, Democratic Party, progressives, all of those words had no meaning to me because I did not see any of those people doing anything ever in my communities growing up. And, you know, those strong statements, like, I don't ever see you, I don't know who you are, those absolute statements, even though I now know intellectually those are not true, that there are, you know, like you meet people and inspiring people that are doing stuff, but I still feel the same emotions, you know, that I grew up with. I still feel that way, even though my brain is like, okay, things are changing. It doesn't feel like they're changing. And it doesn't feel like any of the people who are being radical right now and protesting care anymore than any of the people in the 80s or in the 90s when there were some protests on different things. And so I just wanted to share that almost more like sort of dystopic kind of element of really actually who I am. And that's something that I have to carry to work every day when I'm like, rah, rah, everybody, come on, we're gonna go be progressive and strong and do stuff. Like there's also this bucket that I'm carrying that nobody's seeing except people that can nod because they are similar and had a similar experience. That is really, really heavy. And it's just a bucket I have to carry up the same hill everyone else is going up. But it's like extra baggage. So I bring that even into Black-led protests, like a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement. I bring that into the press conference that we had today, where I wore my African American Coalition Committee, which is an incarcerated person activist group at MCI Norfolk, a state incarceration facility here, where I meet with those guys, and they have helped to draft some of the legislation, for example, ending life without parole, that we're fighting for in the State House. And they're mentors of mine, and it's mutual. I wore that instead of a suit. You know, that's just my little way of saying, I have this heavy bucket, everyone. I'm not wearing a stinking suit to your thing that I have to do, even though I was the one that said we should have a press conference. You know, so that's like what it's like to be me. And I think probably a lot of people can resonate who are not even just in politics, but going into these spaces. I'm also a lawyer. I've also done business consulting. Like I've done now I've gone into a lot of those spaces where I had a deep and abiding distrust and disdain for, until recently. My husband's making me laugh over there. I guess I'm getting loud. You know, you just have to learn how to have the joy. And what I have found is that this particular moment post the tragic murder, and just the way George Floyd was murdered, and the fact that it was on video, the things about it that have hurt me are not the things that I hear coming out of other people's mouths. Because the things that I hear coming out of other people's mouths sound like the pain that I feel every single day, right? I always feel angry and sad and depressed about nobody seeming to listen to the fact that people are being killed worldwide. And in America, Black and brown people are being killed. And shout out to, like, there's a handful of like white groups too, like in Appalachia. I just like to say that as an aside. But here in Massachusetts, Black and brown people are at the forefront of the poverty battle. And we're being crushed by it and killed by it, and killed by the institutional nature of it, in the same way that beautiful young man was crushed by that officer. And his breath was taken from him. That's every day for us. So when I show up to work happy and motivated, I am also feeling that. And if you were to stop and talk to me about it 2 weeks ago, you would have heard the same thing. But nobody does stop and talk about it. Or almost nobody. And so what is hard for me about this time is not, and this sounds callous, but it's not that George Floyd was murdered. I mean, that is as hard as it always is. Every time it's hard. But the new thing that has been hard is like, it's an answer to my prayer that people are waking up. But I have this mixed feeling of like, why did it take videotaping something that happens all the time for you to believe me? For you to believe all of us? Like, why did it take that? And now you want me to be happy that you're waking up? You know, and it's like, I want to rejoice that things are changing, but it was like not how I wanted it to change. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so you bring the focus over into that other lens where you're like, okay, I can tell people that, and some people I do tell that, or I can say, here, do this, or both. And so the do this part, I think, is really, really important to help us hold on to the momentum. But before I list some of the stuff, I'll just list a few, and then we can go in deeper. You can ask questions about other things. I want to just re-emphasize that filing and passing bills is not dealing with the problem. It's a necessary but insufficient step in shifting our culture and our mindset, and having a radical and revolutionary change in how we think about and approach each other, period, but also racial equity, and just equity. What does justice and opportunity for all look like? And the policies help people understand this is how structural racism manifests. And when we change this policy, we're dismantling it. But we're dismantling it in the sense of like, you have a planet worth of matter, and you're gonna like go into an orchard and heal a particular orchard on a planet that has been poisoned over the entire planet. And so you're gonna heal a few trees in a particular orchard. If you have that power, you should do it. But you should not then rest easy that the planet is okay and that the planet is healed. So I'll list this legislation, but please think of it like that with me, not as like, yeah, now we're gonna get that done. And when we do that, we'll be like super down and all the good things, you know? No.
Nika's taking care of it so we can all rest easy.
Yeah.
That's right, or whoever takes care of it, even if it's 1,000 people working on it, same to the same result, except we have more power to go for it. So some of the things we're looking at, everybody's in agreement on something called POST. By everybody, I mean the electeds of color are in agreement with POST reform. In Massachusetts, we don't have, it stands for Peace Officer Standards and Training. And it's a way of licensing police officers. Some states have that. It should be required for every state to have that. But police are not licensed and they cannot lose their license. I'm a lawyer. All I have to do is pay $350 every year and I'm still a lawyer. It doesn't matter how bad I am as long as nobody's filing malpractice against me. I could be like pretty incompetent but not breaking the law and just be fine. If I was a nurse or a doctor, I'd have to take some exams to make sure that, you know, to renew my license, because you could kill somebody with that. Police officers have a gun. Our DA was talking about this at our press conference today. Our DA is African-American woman. So she was with us as elected of color. And she was saying, like, this is a dangerous job. She's also a lawyer, obviously, as a DA. And she said, I can't kill anybody legally as part of my job. And so POST is really, really important because it also enables you to prevent police officers from getting fired over something and then just moving and getting hired again. And so it has some database elements that follow people on their record. Then similarly with civil service training. So in Massachusetts, we want to have, it's similar, but we want to have standards and testing so that to become a civil servant, like when you become a fireman, when you become a police officer, there's certain standards that also have to be met around your record and racial equity. And I'm not as familiar with the details of civil service training, but that's something that there's a lot of consensus around. I can't tell if there's as much consensus around what would be my third priority, which is I said my priority's a little out of order, so I'll fix that in a second. I said my first priority, my fourth priority, third priority, but the consensus goes 1 and 2 in that way. So anyway, I'm sharing the consensus priority list. It came from these guys, the African American Coalition Committee, and that is a commission to study structural racism with a particular focus on the criminal justice system. And the idea is that equal protection laws, even constitutionally, are not applicable in the disparate, you know, as we could apply them to the disparate impacts in the criminal justice system, whether we're looking at arrest, use of force, or sentencing. And so we have somebody at Harvard's doing a study on disproportionate convictions by race and just sort of what that means about our courts. But there's no teeth, you know what I'm saying? So the commission, and these are all bills that have been filed. So the commission would study that problem in more detail and with particular makeup that we trust, and then would provide for recourse. And this is what we should do. And then we could build bills around that provided teeth. So that's a high priority for me, but a lot of people feel like that's dead on arrival, but you know, how many of the things we need to do are dead on arrival initially? You just got to keep resurrecting the idea. And then what is sort of my second priority, but it sort of goes post civil service and then use of force. I would put use of force right after post, because post is so important, because no matter what you do, if you don't have a way to hold the officers accountable to it, it's just like a law on the books that they can say, I didn't do that, right? There's no way of saying, oh, well, the policy said you were supposed to de-escalate and you learned that and you didn't do it. You could just say you didn't de-escalate, and then it's like a disconnect. So use of force, you know, having different laws around use of force, what's allowable, what's legal, there's consensus around that. I am really curious about something that I'm sure many people know about. So just transparently, this is something I need to develop an expertise around. What does the Constitution have to do with, if anything, with how we treat people with regards to use of force? And what, if anything, does the Constitution have to do with our standards of proof when a police officer comes before a grand jury and says, I was scared, and so there's no case? So what does it mean, if anything, constitutionally, that if I'm holding a gun and I'm a police officer, my fear legitimizes my killing of you? But if I have a gun held to my head or my heart, my fear is weaponized against me. And if I react in any way other than totally zen or pleading for my life with my hands open and empty, then I definitely will have no recourse. And even if I do those things, I can just be killed or held accountable for my fear. And so that just if there's nothing in the Constitution that we can hook on, we need to amend our Constitution. So that's something I want to be thinking about for the next 10 years or something. And I know there's probably lots of people thinking and writing, but I want to learn more about that.
Are you okay if we open it up to discussion around that?
Yeah.
Joseph, you got something you want to say?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, you know, like I really do kind of latch on to that statement, right? Because I mean, it could be very hard as a Black man, right, to hear fear, like that someone's fear of you is an excuse, like that anything can happen to you simply because someone is afraid of you, and without anything, without your knowledge, you know. It's kind of like this funny thing that happens, you know, like between transition from Black boyhood to Black manhood, right? Where suddenly you become a threat, like you're no longer like cute and adorable and innocent. People want to hand you candy at the post office. Like, it's like now people are locking their doors. And it's like the people you just got taller. It's people at your church, you know. It's like, you know, it's the same ladies at your church used to hand you candy and unlock the door because I haven't seen your face yet, you know. And that can be a very challenging thing to experience. And then it could, you know, there's nothing you can do about it, right? Like, and there's no way you can communicate it in the abstract, because until you have Black skin, like, you can't really understand the concept of this thing, like, just, you know, how society has made it an indictment of you, right? It doesn't matter what your character is. And I'll tell you, you know, I've been lucky to have some success in this country. You know, I'll be with there was this one moment where, you know, I was just with a group of like other very successful Black men, and we just, you know, I was the baby in the group, you know, but I was just willing to be honest about my experiences with police. And it was like this, almost like a come to Jesus moment. Everybody suddenly was brave enough to be honest. And a lot of people had the most horrible things happen to them, but had never shared it with a single soul. Why? Because it's not supposed to happen to them, right? You know, their pants are up, they have degrees, they have this, that, and the rest. Like, it's not supposed to happen to them. And there's almost like a shame, because everyone in your family, your parents, anyone who has done their very best to protect you from this, right? And so it's almost like a guilt, like you're letting them all down if it happens to you, even though it's completely out of your control, right? And that fear thing is so real. It is so real. And it's crazy to me. I remember, I think I've had a lot of moments that were just frightening, But there's one that was actually, it stands out in my memory because I got pulled over in Wyoming. I was consulting in Wyoming. And everyone knew that, you know, I kind of didn't fit in, right? You go to a drive-through, oh, what are you doing here? And I'm like, oh, you know, you can't tell I'm from Wyoming. I live down the street. No, and it was a thing, but I was getting pulled over a lot. And, you know, I would just literally, the hotel I was staying in, the office I was working at, back and forth, that was it. Right, and maybe I'd get some fast food every now and then. I would never go anywhere because I was always getting pulled over in my little blue Subaru rental car. And I remember this was it was nighttime. I got pulled over. My ID, all of my stuff was in my briefcase, which was in the trunk. I got out of the car, my legs were shaking. I could not stand. And I never, you know, when people say your legs are buckling, like it sounds like a figure of speech until it happens to you. Until you actually don't have control over your legs. And you're like, this is not a figure of speech, this is a real thing. And I was so afraid because I didn't know, there was just too many opportunities, right? For any mistake, any sudden movement. I mean, I had to get my briefcase out of my trunk to show him my ID. How do I do that safely without scaring him? You know? And so I was paralyzed with fear. You know what I mean? And that's something that a lot of people can't relate with because I wish that when I saw police that I felt reassured, right? But I don't. And it's almost like a double tragedy because we all need protectors, you know? And so it's like, you know, and that was a harmless situation. That officer was actually, you know, thank God for him. But I've had situations that were not like that. I've been a victim of many things. And I think I don't want to in my opinion, most Black men won't have a story of like, you know, where they've been victimized. You know, it's more often than not. Here, that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, you know, is how do we get people to believe us? I feel like I'm very credible, you know, but it's almost as though the broader society is extremely comfortable ignoring what 46 million Americans, you know, African Americans have said over and over and over again, right? It takes a certain, I don't know what it takes for the, you know, people in my life, whatever, to casually dismiss or excuse or say, well, maybe you might not understand what's going on, or maybe you're carrying some implicit bias against police or X, Y, and Z. To 46 million Americans, that's a lot of people to dismiss, right? That's a lot of people, and it's just, you know, I have a different history. Right, I'm African. I'm a dual citizen. I'm from Nigeria. You know, when I'm in America, I'm Black. When I'm not, I'm just me. It's like I can feel it at the airport. You know what I mean? And that's something that this country has to kind of deal with. It's not, you know, everywhere has its own issues, but like, you know, I would trade classism for racism any day. Like I really would. I really would. And so it's one of those things where, you know, I have an unshared history, right? My ancestors were not enslaved, but I have a completely shared experience, you know? So one thing that I do is I make sure that my Africans, that they also, you know, carry the baton because, you know, we've won so much freedom, almost all people of all races, just the advocacy and the struggle of you know, the African American community and the civil rights movement and their you know, broader white allies. And I hope that we can capitalize on that do something moment and not let this just be another memory, another footnote. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about it. I mean, you mentioned the civil rights movement and we talk about it as if it was a thing and it's something that happened and it was something that maybe was successful and you know, but I feel like isn't that what we're doing now? Aren't we? Isn't this the civil rights movement? Hasn't it always been? Is it called something else? And I mean, in the end, like what was it that led it to being finished then? I guess it was the passing of the act, but what is it that we need now? I mean, that speaks to what Nika was talking about, and I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in about like what we could do, like more than just policy changes and laws, but what can we do to the Constitution? And I hear that word a lot, and I don't like, it's a beautiful thing. Like, thank God for it. Like, you know, where would we be without it? Where would the world be without the United States Constitution to in a lot of ways lead the charge and for freedom? But it's something about it it needs to be updated.
Yeah.
I don't know what other way to look at it. You know?
Yeah, so I think do you mind if I hop in, or?
Go ahead, of course.
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of what we need to recognize is that the Constitution was never meant to be a complete list of all of our rights, right? The Constitution is a description of rights that were recognized at the time as inalienable, and that there was an intentional process created because they knew, for all of the flaws of the founding fathers, and God knows they had their flaws, they realized that there would be a need for the recognition of additional rights, right? So they created this process for amending the Constitution, which is really an incredible contribution to political dialogue. It was something new and unique, and but yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, for my own personal place within the movement, where I focus really heavily on the drug war, you know, but I focus within a community that has a tremendous amount of white privilege, right? We're mostly working within electronic and jam band scenes. It's a very white crowd. And we're constantly having to educate people within those communities around the idea that your experience with law enforcement is not the experience shared by others within this community. Right? I mean, I will sit on stages at shows and talk very openly about MDMA use and MDMA safety, and then I'll have people in the crowd say, oh, privilege isn't a real thing. It's like, if you think for 1 second at a hip hop concert, I could get on the stage and talk about crack use this way, and that like the cops in the audience would just be sitting there watching this, you're out of your mind, right? I mean, that's just not the reality. And Joseph, that thing you said about not having a shared history, but having a shared experience, for me, it's actually the exact opposite. My father's family I have a tremendous amount of ancestors in my father's family who were Genízaro. They were Native American slaves that were sold to Hispanic settlers. I know the names of many of these slaves. I know the dates they were sold on. But yet I'm very white presenting, right? My mother's family are European Jews. My father's family has a lot of Portuguese ancestry as well. So I at first glance, I'm white passing. The last name, you know, gives it away pretty quickly on the internet. I get told to go back to Mexico all the time. But, you know, my lived experience day to day, you know, dealing with law enforcement on a personal basis, I do have that privilege of being white passing. And so I think the thing we need as either white or white passing people to recognize is that we have a moral obligation to use that privilege we have when we're dealing with law enforcement, when we're dealing with legislators, when we're dealing with power structures, to center, you know, Black and brown voices, and to end the drug war. I mean, I think that's one of the big things we can do to address a tool used by law enforcement to target minority communities. Ending the drug war does not magically end racism, but when you look at the number of people who are incarcerated for nonviolent drug crimes, it's very clear that if we remove that tool from law enforcement, they will have less of an ability to target these communities. And the racism of the drug war is not accidental. It's not secondary. The drug war started as a racist program. It was written by people who had a tremendous amount of racial bias. I have a collection of old newspaper clippings from the start of the drug war. And there's, you know, story after story of, oh, you know, when Mexicans use marijuana, they want to rape white women, right? When African Americans use cocaine, except believe me, they did not use the word African Americans, but, you know, when they use cocaine, they want to rape white women. This was the rhetoric then that was used to justify passing those laws. And the drug war itself has been used to further erode our civil liberties, right? Civil asset forfeiture has basically allowed police to rob minority communities at gunpoint legally. They can take your property, and once they've taken your property, property itself does not have presumption of innocence, so you have to go to court and prove that your property was not involved in a drug crime to get it back. You'll actually see court cases like the state of Virginia versus a 1979 Chevy, or the state of Colorado versus $1 million in cash. And yeah, we know that civil asset forfeiture is used more often on minority communities, more often when minorities are pulled over. And so by taking those tools away from them, my hope is that we can move the conversation, that we can sort of start addressing structural racism. I have a really hard time with incrementalism. I'm fundamentally a revolutionary. I believe in revolutionary change, that revolutionary change is the way to do things. And so, you know, the decriminalized nature movements, I'm actually really concerned about those movements because they tend to be legalizing the drugs that are popular with white people. And so if we just focus on legalizing drugs that are popular with white people, that's not anti-drug war activism, right? It's just legalizing your own toys. And I get that. Like, I like the incremental, the fact that Denver was able to decrim psilocybin, I'm tremendously happy with, and I'm really proud of. But as long as police are targeting minority communities under the, you know, quote unquote crack scourge, you know, crack cocaine and powder cocaine are substantially similar substances. The reason that the government treats crack more harshly than it treats powdered cocaine is that white stockbrokers and college kids tend to use powder cocaine and poor people of color tend to use crack. That's literally it. That's the reason. Top to bottom, they even say it privately. If you look at their private statements, it's clear it was about race. And so my personal belief that the way to do this is to have a constitutional amendment around bodily autonomy and cognitive liberty. We should amend the Constitution to recognize that each of us has the right to control our own minds and bodies. This ends the drug war. It ends attempts to restrict abortion in this country. Once transhumanist technologies start to come online, it makes sure that we have the right to do that, which gets the tech boys interested, which is really helpful when you're trying to pass legislation, to have people with billions of dollars who are willing to support you. But we really need to center the racism at the heart of the drug war in the conversation. Because people think, minorities get arrested more because they use more drugs. That is demonstrably false. We have the data. Most drug dealers in this country are white, middle-class, college-educated. They are not most people arrested, but they are absolutely the norm. We know this statistically. We know there's more white drug users than African American and Hispanic drug users, and yet white drug users are less likely to be arrested. When they're arrested for the same amount of drugs, they're less likely to be charged with felonies. And when they're charged with felonies, they're less likely to be convicted of felonies. And I have no way of saying this other than that's fucked. Like, that's it. Like, that's the only way I know how to say it. And so, yeah, I think we need to center that conversation. You know, and this is a rare case because George Floyd was not being stopped for a drug crime. But if you look at the history of minorities who were unjustly killed by police, drugs are often sort of at the center of those claims. But even with George Floyd, the state coroner said, a contributing factor were some drugs that might be in his system. There hasn't even been a toxicology report, and the coroner is already trying to blame the victim, saying, he must have been on drugs. That's the only way he could have died from this incident. You know, ignoring the 250-pound boot on his neck to blame the person who may have been using drugs is just so absurd. I don't know how to address something that absurd, to be honest with you. But
well, I mean, I've shared a lot of those thoughts and you know, in context of how, you know, the constitutional amendment that you mentioned sounds like an amazing idea. And in terms of racism and you know, police brutality, I'm sure it's been thrown out there. You know, the question is like, how does something like that even come to fruition in this climate and in this government and in the way that politics is set up? And how can this be a different conversation than the exact same one we had a few months ago or years ago? Because, and that's what I've really been concerned about, is like, how does this not just become something that, you know, like Nika said, a few changes happen, but nothing substantial. So how does this country today in 2020 make substantial change occur? And it does not sound like it could happen overnight. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think it doesn't happen overnight. But I will say that when I was younger, I got to hear Alicia Appelman-German speak in Florida. She was a Holocaust survivor, wrote a really amazing book about her experiences surviving the Shoah. And one of the things she said in her talk that has stuck with me, I mean, I was like 11 or 12 when I heard her speak. I'm 39 now, so decades later. She said that every major social change looks impossible the day before it happens and inevitable the day after. Right. And that really stuck with me. You know, the idea that women would ever have the vote. Why would men dilute their vote by voting for women to be able to vote? Right. Why would men do that? Like, why would we free the slaves? Like, all these major social changes, look, gay marriage, I mean, all of them, they look absolutely impossible before they happen and inevitable the day after. And so I hope that, you know, ending the drug war looks like that, that once we end the drug war, it's going to look inevitable. How could we have not ended the drug war decades ago? You know, I hope when we finally take armed white supremacists attacking minorities in this country, when we finally start treating that like the domestic terrorism that it is, I think we're going to look back and say, oh, it's, of course we had to treat it that way, right? Of course it's inevitable that we would treat these groups that are attacking people based on their race as terrorism. We're before the change, and I'll agree with you, it looks impossible before the change. The hope that I hang on to is that it will look inevitable after. But I fully agree that standing on this side of the door, it does look really impossible. I just take solace in the fact that it always looks that way, right? Every change looks that way. And so I take some personal solace in that.
Exactly. You know, like when abolishing, you know, slavery, it's abolishing the economic system of the South. It's like, let's get rid of the economy. You know, that's a radical idea, right? But it happened. And so one thing that I want to, you know, focus on, and that I'm always quick to say is, you know, a lot of people, when we talk about our current form of policing and moving to a community base or anything, people can often, well, what are you going to replace it with? You know, and I'm like, anything. We have the ability to create. We've written all these fantastic laws, created a wonderful system of governance, expanded the middle class in such a way that we can all be here talking to each other right now over the internet. You know, we can do anything. And so really kind of helping people recognize the power that they possess and the power that we have as society to reshape our world is very, very important, you know?
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of define that. I think when people hear these ideas like abolishing the police or abolishing prisons, they think that people are advocating for tomorrow, we're just going to like get rid of all the police or all of the prisons. And with all the class inequalities and all the things that are going on right now, we're just going to deal with it. And that's not what abolitionists mean. When folks talk about abolishing the police, they're talking about defunding and demilitarizing the police, and then eventually moving towards a space where we can get rid of the police as they exist today and replace policing and replace the prison system with a number of other alternatives that will actually bring safety and wellness and equity to our communities. And there's an incredible plethora of things out there that are viable alternatives to policing. Transformative justice and restorative justice practices and restorative justice systems are being practiced not just in schools, but also at community levels where people might get arrested for a crime, and instead of being charged with a crime and brought into a court to be prosecuted and potentially sent to jail or prison, people are being given the opportunity to speak with the person that they victimized, and to have the victim and the perpetrator come together in conversation and lay out to one another what are the ways that the victim's been affected by what the perpetrator has done, what are the things in the perpetrator's life that's brought them to this moment, and where can the healing happen, where can the restoration of harm happen, and how can people actually come together through mutual agreements to restore that, and then how can the surrounding community, whether that be a neighborhood, whether that be the rest of a classroom, whatever it may be, how can they come together and encircle those people in a way that holds accountability, right? There's accountability processes that we can talk about for this kind of thing. There is so much resources and funding that needs to be poured into organizations and groups that are providing response work when people have psychological breakdowns or go through moments where them being mentally differential brings them to some kind of extreme moment that people see in society, and their first reaction is to call the police on someone. And instead what we can be doing is calling groups of people who are trained to respond in those kinds of situations. there's just so much resourcing and work and funding that we can be putting into these kinds of viable alternatives that I think it's a very practical thing for us to be demanding in this moment, that police departments are defunded at a massive scale. There's so much talk about reforming the police and body cameras and all this kind of thing. And the track record is showing over the last couple decades that it's really not working sufficiently. And at a time where we are hit with such economic impact as a populace, what if instead of having 30%, 40%, in some cases 60% of a city's general budget going to the police department, that money can be going towards schools and education, towards mental health services, towards getting people food, towards getting people housing. I mean, these are the root causes of the vast majority of the crime that we see. It's not, you know, people trying to exploit and extract from each other out of some kind of malice. It's people just trying to get their needs met in a system that doesn't allow people to meet their needs. So I think that the conversations around abolishing the police and abolishing prisons are a really important one to have. And it's important to ensure that people don't have this misinterpretation or reaction that we're going to go from 0 to 100 in the snap of a finger. This is like a transformative process. And that's what I think personally that we need to be focusing on right now is, like Nika said in the beginning, not thinking that there's going to be this specific number of reforms or policies that the government at a federal or state or city level can pass and then everything will be fixed, or at least the problem will be, you know, quelled enough that we can all go back to life as usual and not think about these things anymore. We need a collective learning process, a collective understanding, and a collective transition away from systems of extraction, exploitation, and incarceration, and towards systems of healing, of regeneration, and of mutually meeting one another's needs. And I think that's another really important point to make is the people that you're seeing out in the streets right now, including the people that folks are criticizing the tactics and strategies of as they materialized in the streets over the last week, these are the same people that are running mutual aid projects over the last 2 months since COVID hit. These are the same people that are doing food distribution projects in order to get people food that don't have access to food because supply chains are breaking down. You know, these are the same people that are supporting tenants to make sure that they don't get evicted because they can't pay the rent, and doing solidarity work with tenants. Like this social movement from below that we're seeing, it is stopping the harm and resisting the oppression that's being done, but it's also creating viable alternatives. And it's bringing forward the ways that we can relate to one another that will lead a pathway forward. And it really does start with, you know, meeting one another's material needs. And that does necessitate like a breakdown of the class system that keeps so many people hoarding so much wealth and so many people completely impoverished and without their basic needs being met.
I think I do think it might be a good time to switch gears and maybe, you know, just judge, you know, it is Tuesday, June 2nd, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. Tuesday, June 2nd. And I think Monday, June 1st will be a historical day for this country with the words that our leadership put out yesterday and last night. And yeah, leadership, as well as that, you know, leaked file with his call to the leaders of the states of this country. And you know, I feel like it would be cool to hear some perspective and some voices around that, you know, and how we're feeling today and how we think the people are feeling. And just generally kind of to switch gears and to discuss this protest movement and maybe why is it different and how can it be successful and how can it not be successful?
I only have one small thought on this that I'd like to put out there. I was down in Denver this weekend. I wasn't doing frontline action. I have a little bit of a rolled ankle right now, so I didn't want to get too in the faces of the police, but I was down there providing supplies and photographing. And one of the things I noticed is that all of the National Guard and most of the Denver police were not wearing any sort of identifiable name tags, badges with numbers on them, anything. In fact, a large number of the Denver police were wearing badge-shaped patches. So from a distance, it looked like they were wearing their badges, which they're supposed to have on with the badge number. And then when you got closer, you realized it was literally just like a stick-on Velcro patch that said, police. The fact that law enforcement would actively hide their identities during a major action like this, I find to be incredibly dangerous. And I would really like to see every state in the country pass a law that anyone carrying a weapon in a law enforcement capacity, right, whether you're a National Guard, U.S. military, now that Trump is threatening to send in the actual military, law enforcement, sheriffs, anybody who is engaging in law enforcement or, quote unquote, anti-riot actions should be identifiable from a distance through some sort of numbering system. I don't care if we spray paint your number on your chest, however we need to do it so that we can identify the law enforcement that are behaving in inappropriate ways. Footage just came out of a cop in Denver shoving a photographer into a fire. There was the footage from Atlanta of those officers tasering the kids in their car. The fact that we can't identify who these officers are is unacceptable. And so that would be my one contribution to something that we need to do right away, is require these law enforcement to identify themselves in a visual way. Because even in Denver, it says right in the Denver Police Departmental Policy Guidelines that they're supposed to identify themselves by name and badge number when asked. And I went down the row of cops asking each one of them, hey, why are you not wearing your name? What's your name and badge number? Why are you not wearing your name? I mean, this live stream is on my Facebook page right now. And not a single one of them would identify themselves by name or badge number. Not one. And so we need to fix that, and we need to give that enforcement teeth. Maybe to the point where if you're not wearing a name and badge number, any arrest you make is not valid. But something to give that teeth. But I don't know what the actual on the ground solution is, because it's already in their guidelines. They're supposed to do it and they're just ignoring it.
And just to be clear, this is not new.
Sure. No, I mean, I've seen that since.
No, I mean, we've been seeing this in the streets for the last 20 years at least. Police taping over their badge numbers, not wearing their badge numbers, and not identifying themselves.
Nika, do you have any, have you been hearing anything from at the state level of how, I suppose maybe the city, like the Boston PD are handling the protests, and how's that coming? How's that looking, I guess, at this point?
Yeah, I think, some of the things you hear about in other cities, you don't hear about as frequently here. Mm-hmm. The culture and the mindset shift is still problematic and a challenge. So, for example, I work with one of the youth leaders in one of my public housing developments in my district, and we check in regularly. He's a young Black man who grew up in and has chosen to continue living in that same housing development. And we had, sadly, a homicide a little more than a week ago. And it was kind of like a local thing. It was just, but some people were at a gathering and just lost it, and somebody shot somebody. And so it's got that special air of tragedy where it's just like your neighbors are shooting each other. Boys, whatever. And so he was there, and a police officer came up and grabbed him for him to move out of the way in this sort of aftermath situation. And he turns on his Facebook Live, and he's showing me this. And the reason I asked him to show me this is because he said, yeah, the police officer grabbed me. This young man is exceptional at expressing his feelings. So he showed me the video of him telling him, I'm feeling very angry because you're grabbing me. And I'm glad you're here because you're never here. So thanks for coming to our community. And when he said, thanks for coming to our community, the officer responded, community, is that what you call this place? Oh. And it was that part of the story that was like, what's his badge number? I want to see the video, send me the video and give me his badge number. I will talk to the captain. So yeah, we know who he is, but he doesn't see, this officer doesn't see, and all this stuff happened the last 2 days, so I haven't followed up yet because that happened. I got that information on Sunday. But it's clear that the officer doesn't see that. If you don't see this as a community, then you don't see its members as human beings. And my youth worker knew that. He said, he was saying to him, "You're dehumanizing me." And for the officer, there was a disconnect. Like, what are you talking about? And I could only imagine the officers thinking, I know some of the guys, I don't know this one, but the officers thinking, how can this feel like a community to you? I'm always coming in here when people get killed. Like, that's like his, I'm guessing, you know? I'm guessing it was a regular guy thing to say, not like some super racist thing. And that's one of the reasons I don't like talking about good cops and bad cops. I don't say this too often because, like, in every profession, as somebody said today at our press conference, in every profession, there's a percentage of people that are just bad eggs. They either just show up, they don't do their job, or they undermine whatever the job is. And then you have people that are deeply racist and malevolent. And you have police officers that are that way. And that's dangerous, and not holding those situations and people accountable and districts accountable is dangerous. However, if we held all of those people accountable, Black men would still fear for their lives. You know,
Right.
And I would argue not that much less frequently.
Right.
Because it's the good guys like this officer who feel totally justified and like, I'm just a regular guy from a nice home in a nice neighborhood. This isn't what a nice home and neighborhood is. You know, like that kind of thinking being totally acceptable way to look at people, that thinking is perpetuated by Black and brown people as well. That thinking that a criminal is a kind of a person and not a kind of a behavior that anybody can perform. Anybody can perform a criminal behavior. And anybody who's performed a criminal behavior can be any kind of person. But because we have these twisted mindsets, and the police have them, and the community has them, right? And I'm going to say something maybe slightly controversial and say, those of us who are fighting against that mindset, most of us, it's because we don't like the results of it for us, right? Or for people that we care about, or issues that we care about. But we haven't really dealt with the fact inside of us that there's a violence about thinking that your worldview is the right one. And other people need to submit to it. And it's one of my challenges often to the progressive movement, which is that if your approach to progressive justice is one where you take out all of our enemies and replace them with us, you are in a long tradition of people who are deepening the global trend towards death and destruction. That is not what justice for all needs to look like. And so it's hard because we need and have to hold the police accountable. But if we don't talk to, I'm not going to say his real name, but let's say Officer O'Connor, it's a different Irish name. If we don't talk to Officer O'Connor and say, where are you coming from with that? There's no amount of discipline that's going to shift Officer O'Connor. And so what happens here in Boston, or what is happening, is that we're having protests. Some small percentage of people attack the police. Very often, from my understanding, they're interlopers from other communities who have come in with very specific anti-police agendas that might be like rooted in things that I agree with. But this behavior, they come into Black and brown communities and they attack the police. And the police react or overreact, you know, depending. And then elected officials condemn either the behavior of the police or the behavior of the person who attacked the police. And then there's usually some police officer somewhere that does something illegal or inappropriate, like snatches a sign from somebody in frustration, and that blows up on social media. And then the police commissioner comes out and says, well, those elected officials that are saying that we shouldn't have been wearing riot gear, well, several of our people got shot at today, and so it's okay to wear riot, and it wasn't really riot gear, it was a bulletproof vest and a helmet, and it saved lives today, and you don't care about us, so I hope people will unelect you. You know, this is a dialogue at present. And so we're trying to like reverse that and have a sit down with each other, and I'm not sure how that's gonna go, because there's a lot of emotions where people are reacting in fear and anger on all sides, and everybody feels justified because the attack on them has been a legitimate attack for reasons that are deeply understood and relatable for the person who did the attack often. Because nobody's disagreeing on like some random person coming in crazy town, like trying to kill, you know, whoever they're trying to kill. Nobody's disagreeing on that. People are disagreeing and angry at each other about the legitimate beefs that everybody has. And so I feel concerned that we're not including police officers in our kumbaya moments, which I know is a pejorative term, but I always liked getting around the campfire and singing kumbaya. It was like a real thing, like a kind of a spiritual thing, you know? I think we need to reclaim that a bit. And we need to make sure that everybody's in it. The people that feel like our enemies and the people that feel like our allies.
Well, I mean, how is it that for me, it's like police officers are currently, like today, during this movement, the past week, that's the group that there's so much conflict with, that you're saying we should bring into this conversation, and how do we get those Americans to join us in working towards a place where we can all be safer, and in that, I think we can have that conversation. We can see that future, like I even as hard as it is, but for me, it's really the vast, this white America that does identify as racist or as white supremacist, or that are perpetuating these groups on Facebook. That there's so many of them that are actively working and using the word civil war, and that's their perspective on all of this, is that they've got to arm themselves and they have to fight back. And I mean, it's concerning, and that's who he was speaking to yesterday. And for whatever reason, it's his base. And you know, how do we figure out how to get those people, and more so than cops? I mean, not a lot, but some cops are those people. But I think that this is it needs to continue. This movement is not just, for me, is not just about law enforcement and police brutality. It is about systemic racism, and it is about working through that today, right now, leading up to this election. And when it comes to the Constitution, it's about how do we amend this Constitution so that this is something that ends and it does not persist, and it's not about their free speech any longer. And I think if we can start there, then we can find ourselves like being able to work through the rest. But I don't know.
I feel temporarily discouraged. I have hope for the future, but we have Trump and we have Biden. These are not the people that are going to lead us out of white supremacy. So Trump leads us more deeply into it. And, you know, Biden is incapable of seeing white supremacy in himself, like most of the Democratic Party, even many people of color in it. I mean, like for me, I try to see white supremacy in myself, and it's hard, but I do that work. I ask myself those questions. I've taken an assessment on it. That's what woke me up. I took an assessment at my last job, and I made my whole team take it. Well, you know, they wanted to take it, but I required it, and I aced the white supremacy exam. It was white supremacy for people of color-led organizations. And so it was, the framing was different so that you could see it in yourself even if you were not white. And I aced it. I was like, I'm a really good white supremacist, and I've been working my whole life. I've been using the language of not doing that. And so it just was a wake-up call that it's so, if you're successful at anything, you're deeply steeped in it. And most people that have failed at everything they've tried are also deeply steeped in it. But if you're successful, you are definitely deeply steeped in it. And so for our nation to change, I do think it is one of those rare cases where the top leader has to lead. I think most of the time, grassroots leadership means a lot more than what the top leader does.
Is Bernie out?
Because of the level of visibility that top leaders have, they're going to continue to perpetuate whatever they're like. And so until we get somebody in that position, or maybe totally change and don't have that position, or whatever, whichever happens first. But until we get somebody in that position that can point the finger here and show the nation what it looks like to turn away from a historic route that we benefit from, sacrificially giving up our rights to hold on to hate and call it something else, and naming it and doing that in a way that's accessible to people. Until we get that, it's the Civil War. Somebody said today, do you think there's going to be another Civil War? In my opinion, the Civil War has never ended. It's not like in Germany where like there was a loser and then they like erased all the stuff from the Hitler stuff, and like they're like none of that was true, and they reconditioned everybody and like took down memorials and put, that's what historically it means to lose a war, right? It's over, and you're not allowed to talk about the losing side with equal parity as you talk about the winning side. And I don't know how I feel about that, but that is not what happened in our Civil War. It was more like a contract. And so the sentiment has continued, and there's been parity. Even the flags are still flying to this day. What country do you know that wins a war and they still fly the flag of the country they defeated? Again, I'm still not sure how I feel about all the bellicoseness in general, but our Civil War is going on until today. Somebody said race wars are going to explode again. Race wars have been going on from the beginning, and we've just been losing. And so our side of the story is made invisible. And then every once in a while we get up there, and then it's like, oh, there's a race war. No, this is the same thing. And so we do need to be more mindful about our governors and our presidents. And it's not going to work for us to be hopeless. Like, we can't just keep saying, like I did my whole life, like I mentioned earlier, what difference does it make? We have to force it to make a difference, because if we don't change those people, it's just going to keep swinging back.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I'm grateful for being on this call today and for able to share these important messages and stories. I would like to disagree on the term race war. I always thought that just there was too much opportunity for misinterpretation with that, right? Since if it's a race war, the people who I'm fighting against, they want a race war, and so. I don't want to use the same vocabulary as the people who would see me harmed. I think it's not.
That is right. So let me just say, I received that. Yes, I agree with that.
No, I know it was just, the colloquial, like, I think it's the struggle, not a struggle. I think, being an abolitionist means adopting a lifestyle, means understanding consciously that it is the struggle. There's going to be little moments where you win and a lot of moments where you lose, but it's not happening, all at once. And when you embrace the struggle and not a struggle, I think that's the change. That's what our entire society should have done. That would have been a true reconstruction, a struggle.
Rhetoric's important.
Yeah, exactly.
Very important. We need to watch our words for sure. We got leadership that doesn't know how to do that.
And it's programming us in very, very harmful, very tribal, and just ways that there's just no room for all the things that make us sweet and human and lovely. You know, there's just, you know, we rip that away, and so I'm hoping that we can carry on, and I'm grateful to have the allyship and friendship and to be in the struggle, you know, with everyone here. So thank you very much.
Right.
Unfortunately, I have to go soon, and so it was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Is there anything else? Any groups you want to shout out, or anything that you
Oh yeah. So I'd love to shout out Dallas Social Venture Partners. I would like to shout out BYP Dallas. So that's the Black Youth Project. So those are two organizations right now that I think are trying to move the needle, and they operate completely kind of different sides of the social spectrum. One is more, upper middle class, white adjacent, and one is more direct action in the streets. But there are some links between the two that are really bringing together unity in the city. And then the Dallas DA, John Crusoe, which has time and time again shown his commitment to doing the right thing and suffering the consequences in public. So yesterday, a lot of people tried to force his hand to arrest, several hundred protesters. He refused to charge them. And so this is Texas, right? He's done a lot of things that have been brave and important. And so I'd like to shout him out as well. I'm working with my organization, it's Philanthrolab, philanthrolab.co. We make ethical technology products. And right now we're looking at ways to help keep people in their homes and really fight the eviction crisis, which is a huge contributor to just exacerbating poverty,
Yeah, well, Dallas is. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it isn't as dangerous. It isn't as scary of a city as it was when we were kids, or maybe before that. It seems to have. Maybe it's this DA. I don't know what it is, but it seems to have slowly be moving in a safer and a better direction, and hopefully for this community of color. I can't speak to it, but I'm sure there's much work to be done. But thanks for your work, man. Thanks for being here. And maybe we could just let everybody kind of give some final words and some shout outs, and we can wrap this up for now. I know personally, I would like to continue this. I could do another hour of this conversation in this context of the protests, of this movement, of these issues in terms of corruption. I know that's what's important to me as being a part of the Bernie Sanders, volunteer effort for years. In looking at this Democratic and this Republican and this democracy, I see the unity in all of us and all these groups in fighting against the corruption that is systemic and does allow all of this to continue. And if you're not anti-corruption, then you're on a wrong team, in my opinion. But so maybe we can come back together soon. But maybe Ryan, you want to go next?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think there's a lot of young people in the streets right now that are very new to this. Also, I just want to take a moment to say, Joseph, thank you so much for being here. And if you have to piece to go do some work, feel free. No obligation to stick. But I think it's really important to offer some of the experiences and training and how to a lot of the folks that are in the streets right now. I would be really happy to come back on this podcast another time, maybe a week from now, and offer some of that. I think it's very, very, very essential that today we prioritize Black and Brown voices. And so I've been very intentional about being very quiet and not taking up a lot of space. And as someone who's been focusing on direct action and social movements and being in the streets for the last 20 years, there's a lot of stuff that I think it's important to share with people soon, because people are learning through experience, and they could be learning from folks who have had experiences already. I'm seeing a lot of people get really violently harmed, and also risk their security by not necessarily doing things in the right way in terms of how they communicate with each other and how they call for actions and things like that. There are people that are, winding up in hospitals after being shot with a less lethal ammunition, and they're being told by the hospital that they're blind now for the rest of their life. There's a lot of people being tear gassed and being shot with rubber bullets and flashbangs and concussion grenades and tear gas that haven't experienced this before and don't really know how to respond to those kind of things. So I think that's a really important thing that we'd come back to at some point. But I want to name that we're seeing a social uprising that we haven't seen in the last 20 years and a lot longer, I think, but I'm only going to speak from direct observation. And it's not going to be controllable. We're not seeing the usual political organizations, the usual nonprofits that are often at the front of these things at the front anymore. And we're seeing a lot more spontaneous gathering in the streets and spontaneous demonstrations and things like that. And I think that's important to recognize. And I think it's very important that we come together as a community and we ensure that we are going to protect each other from the state. We can have conversations amongst ourselves about what tactics are appropriate, what strategies make the most sense. We can keep each other in check, but handing each other over to the police, snitching on each other to the police, collaborating with the state that is going to criminalize and prosecute and incarcerate people, I don't think is appropriate in this time. So I just want to be really clear about that, that we need to keep each other safe and protect each other out in the streets and at demonstrations, and not collaborate with the same police departments that we are protesting against because they are so violent, because they take people's life unnecessarily, because they incarcerate people for things that don't deserve incarceration. This is not the time to be collaborating with them. And I've seen some of that, and it scares me a bit, and it's just something that I wanted to name. And another thing that I want to name is just the really important need right now to create the positive projects, the viable alternatives, at the same time as we're resisting the harm that's being done. People are going to increasingly look to other ways of getting their essential needs met, food, housing, medical care, and things like that. And the more that we can self-organize at the grassroots level to provide those kind of things, the better off we'll be, and the less we'll have to rely on the corporate state convergence, and the more we can rely on ourselves and each other in our own communities. So if being out in the streets right now is not something that you can do, you can be supporting these demonstrations from home in a number of ways, or you can be working on some of the projects that we're going to be needing more and more. People are going to be needing food brought into their neighborhoods and their communities where grocery stores are getting, expropriated from or burned down. People are going to need food delivered and food grown locally. There's so many things that we can be doing. And this is really the time to pull back from whatever we're otherwise invested in. I mean, what better opportunity, right? We are already facing this COVID crisis where people are having to shelter in place. We're already facing this moment where people are kind of getting either a full break or a little bit of a break from a lot of their usual employment, where business as usual isn't just the mentality that we're going to just work and work and work to accumulate wealth until we, retire. What better time than now to pull back from some of the patterns and tendencies that a lot of us have been in, and to really focus full on a collective movement towards liberation. And I think that, Nika named it, but at a time when the two options that we have for the presidency are Joe Biden or someone who literally last night called for governors in every state to bring in National Guard. And if they don't do so sufficiently, he will send fully armed militarized troops to their states to take care of it for them. At a time when these are our two political choices for the highest office, I would, implore us to start looking at some of the more decentralized ways that we can do small p politics, meaning that how we can figure out how to govern ourselves, facilitate economy for ourselves, make decisions amongst ourselves, form collectives, come together in solidarity and community. Like, we can build the spaces and systems that we need amongst ourselves to take care of each other's needs. And I would love to see a vast resourcing of those kinds of grassroots and decentralized projects right now. So yeah, those are some of the last, things I want to name before we go. And I just want to say that I'm totally open to coming back on this podcast and sharing a lot of like direct experiences that I've had at demonstrations and in the streets over the last 20 years, and how people can keep one another safe, protect one another, and how we can be effective. There's a lot to learn from that kind of direct experience. And yeah, I just want to honor and thank Mitchell and Nika, and also you, Richard, for being here and for having this conversation. And I'm humbled and honored to be a part of it, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you. Nika, do you got to go, or Mitchell? Which one of you guys feel like you got to go sooner than the other?
I can actually speak quickly, and then I'll be done. So I would say, for anyone interested in ending the drug war, Dancesafe, Drug Policy Alliance, and SSDP are all great organizations. They're organizations that are all serious about centering Black and brown voices, or trying to move in that direction so that we can really focus ending the drug war where it started, where, coming from these marginalized communities, and those are the communities that have been most affected by the war on drugs. For anyone who's going to be getting involved in frontline protests, it's really something that it's worth spending a couple hours online, learning best practices. Don't show up thinking you know the answers. Listen to the people of color who are leading these movements. Listen to the people on the ground who know how to deal with an aggressive militarized law enforcement. I know, as a young, white presenting person, at my first protest, at the FTAA protest in Miami, I had my eyes opened real quickly about the reality of militarized law enforcement. And if you're not expecting that, if you don't have experience with that, you really can get hurt or killed. And so learning how to deal with militarized law enforcement and listening to the people who've been dealing with this for years and years and years, and allowing the people who are being most harmed by these actions to be the ones who lead the movement, is something that we all have a responsibility to do. And so, yeah, really, harm reduction is real. Learn how to deal with the harms of law enforcement. Tear gas is not the end of the world. Anyone who gets involved in these movements long enough, you are going to get tear gas. You're probably going to get shot with non-lethal or less lethal rounds. And it's something you need to know going into these spaces, that this is real and it's happening, and it will happen to you if you put yourself
no matter how peaceful you are.
No matter how peaceful you are. I mean, I have personally seen agent provocateurs. I have seen law enforcement undercover as protesters engaging law enforcement with violence so that the police have a reason to enact violence against protesters. I have seen this happen. I have watched it happen. It really does happen. And so no matter how peaceful you are, no matter how peaceful your community is, if law enforcement sends agent provocateurs into the protest to throw bricks at cops, they're going to attack you, and then the person who threw that brick will walk right through the police line and hop into a police van, because they are the police. That does happen. And so, yeah, just knowing how to deal with those situations and allowing people of color to be at the leadership positions within that. And if you're a person who is white, relatively well off, privileged, figuring out how you can place yourself between law enforcement and the people they want to hurt is a real tactic, and one that I deeply respect, and one that is worth learning. But you have to do it in the right way, and you have to know what you're doing, because none of us want to see you get, take a beanbag round to the head and die, because I've seen, that's a thing that happens too. So I'm going to hop off. Thank you guys so much for hosting this. Nika, it was really lovely digitally meeting you. Perhaps in the post-COVID age, we can do this in a not digital way. But yeah, please stay safe, everyone. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
For being here, man. So we'll let you round it out, Nika. And any final words, or any groups that you feel strongly about that you'd like to have our viewers check out or look up, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, I think with regards to the police brutality piece, it's important to follow what the NAACP is recommending in your area locally. They're local chapters and they're volunteer run typically. So one might be really progressive and one might not. I don't really know how that works. But it seems to me that with regards to the needs of Black and Brown people, vis-a-vis justice and vis-a-vis criminal justice, they are on the leading edge nationally, as well as here in Boston, of bringing the theoretical into very specific policies that are important. I think that these days it's not difficult for people to figure out who in your community is really mobilizing and organizing and following Black and Brown leadership. I think what's important is to remember that, well, I think that there is not an us and a them. And one of the most problematic features of institutionalized poverty, structural racism, anti-LGBTQ sentiment that becomes institutionalized and part of our human culture and structure is we're not really fighting people. We're fighting a long and historic, deeply rooted, almost like culturally, genetically passed down set of mentalities. And every mentality we're fighting, we also have. And so I think there's nothing more dangerous than identifying any people group, whether it's police officers or students or whatever it is, members of DSA, young Black men, identifying any people group as the problem is perpetuating the problem. And so if it truly is an institutional problem, we have to build trust amongst the people who have a false sense of being enemies. And that's not to say that people aren't held accountable for horrendous behavior or bad behavior. And one of the things I think growing up as a Black woman in low-income communities, I feel like there's almost like a culture of love that is like incredibly fierce. And so when you talk about loving someone as a Black woman, that isn't like a soft, gushy thing where they're gonna walk all over you. That's not what you mean by that. When you talk about loving a community or a group of people, like you're not picturing like just standing back and meekly watching them go willy-nilly. When you're loving your child, it can be pretty rough in our communities. It can be firm, it can be ferocious. And it has to be to keep each other safe.
It does.
That's the kind of love I'm talking about. That's the kind of collaboration I'm talking about. It's sometimes ugly and even chaotic, but it means we're going to stick together even with people that are self-destructive or destructive of others. We're going to contain, hold accountable, and do what we need to do, call out, be firm. But we're only going to be able to hear from each other if we have meaningful relationships. And it doesn't have to be with everybody, but in any group, there's a small group of people that really is honest and true and wants to seek truth. And we have to find each other across the lines that are dividing us. And when we do, we'll organically discover the pathway to justice, but not without that.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. So I don't know if you guys knew this, but I've been doing this podcast for months now, and I'm a spoken word poet. I've been doing that work as my gonzo journalist work, and I was just gonna round this. I always read at least one poem in my my podcast. So I have a short one here called "The American Reality." I'm just gonna read that, and then we'll call it, and we'll all get back to our good work out there. So this is the American reality. The American dream. It implies that we, Americans must want for something grander, something better, something different, that we should not be satisfied, that we have to want for more. When are we allowed to love what we have, who we are, and what our home is to us? The American reality. There are powers, individuals, corporations, families that need us to dream. Our instability, our confusion, our frustration, our distrust, our poverty, our lack is their gain. More than ever, there are ways we can share, thrive collectively, have work, have healing. We do deserve healing. That's it. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys. We'll be back next week, every week, Fear and Loving with Ranch, and check us out at Real Fear and Loving on Twitch, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I mean, trying to manage all these social profiles. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Be well, Nika.
Big love.